Thank you so much for having me. This is sort of distracting, but I'll get used to it. I'm really excited to be here, and I loved this book. So it's a relief to come and talk about a book that you love, especially when you know lots of people probably loved it. How many of you have read the book? I'm curious. Oh, good. So a good group of you out there. So if you've read it, I hope I do justice to what you got out of it. And if you haven't read it, spoilers alert. I'm going to tell you a lot about it. But it's a big book, as we were just discussing. So there's plenty beyond what I'll tell you to discover in the book. So I hope the rest of you will consider reading it. I wanted to start and just mention that my father decided to read my book a few months ago. And I was speaking to him on the phone, and he said, before then I think my parents had only read the acknowledgments to see where they were thinking. I was speaking to him on the phone, and he said, I have an academic question for you. Not an academic question, but an academic question about academics. Why is everything footnoted? And, that got me thinking about popular history versus academic history, that, historians as well as journalists write popular history. It's marketed differently. The editors have different demands, and academic historians have, for writing for an academic press, for an academic audience, have certain burdens on them that I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because this is a work of popular history by a journalist, and historians sometimes get a little prickly, like, journalists are invading our territory, and she's a bestseller and nobody reads my book. So, but I think this book is a great example of what's wonderful about of history, rigorous history written for popular audiences, and what it can do that sometimes academic books can't quite accomplish. So, okay. And I tried to read this book really as two different readers, as the academic who knows a lot of this history and who knows some of the scholarly debates and about the Great Migration and these issues, and also as a lay reader, as somebody coming to it from that perspective. This book has been called deeply affecting, finely crafted and heroic, lush, expansive, and harrowing, a narrative epic rigorous enough to impress all but the crankiest of scholars, yet so immensely readable as to land the author a future place on Oprah's couch. It's won dozens of awards. I'm not going to list them all, including an award for oral history, and it was on over 30 best of the year lists. The key, I think, here is the beautifully written narrative. Historians writing for academic audiences have to make arguments and marshal evidence and foreground that and justify every claim, etc. Writing for popular audiences frees one, I think, to really focus on storytelling. And storytelling, I think, can reach us on a level that argument can't. It's not that there aren't arguments in here, and I'll talk about some of those, some implicit, some explicit, but storytelling and really getting an intimate look into individuals' lives, their emotions, their psychology. It takes the best of the new social history from the 60s of looking at ordinary people and seeing them as important, but it gets us to truths that academic argument can. So that's one of the things I really appreciated about this. She does ask questions that historians would ask. She asks, why did migrants leave the South? What did the move mean to them? How did they fare, and why did they fare that way? But as I said, she doesn't have to take on every other explanation and defend her claims to the end, defend the representativeness of her sample, systematically build an argument. She answers with individual stories. So let me tell you a little bit about Isabel Wilkerson, the author. She was the Chicago bureau chief for the New York Times. And in that position, she won a Pulitzer Prize. She was the first black woman in the history of journalism to win that prize. She's now a professor of journalism and director of narrative nonfiction at Boston University. And she herself is a child of the Great Migration. Her parents came from the South I think, Georgia and Virginia, and met each other in Washington, D.C., and she talks about being in grade school, an affluent white grade school, she says, and hearing other students talk about their immigrant ancestors and how they came to this country with nothing, seeking a better life and risking everything to make something of themselves. And she said, she writes, "Over time, I came to realize that the same could be said of my family and of millions of other Black Americans who had journeyed north during the Great Migration." So she says, "I grew up the daughter of immigrants, a Southerner once removed." And this is one of her arguments, is to look at the Great Migration of African Americans, which is the movement of some 6 million African Americans from the South largely to cities, small and large cities in the North and in the West between World War I and the 1970s. So this is a massive migration within the United States, but she's trying to equate it to an immigrant's journey. And that's one of her key arguments. So her story really is, her project is to tell the story of these 6 million African Americans leaving the South over a long period of time. It's a lot of people, and it's a long time period, and it's a large geographic span. So how does one do that, right? Before the Great Migration, before World War I, 90% of all African Americans lived in the South, the states of the former Confederacy. And by the late 20th century, almost half lived outside of the South. So it's a massive movement. And there's no shortage of historical work on various aspects of the Great Migration. Only a handful of historians have attempted a kind of broad treatment because of some of the things I said about how historians have to work, right? It's very difficult to do that large scope. Historians have looked at, religion, or they've looked at culture, or they've looked at one city and the Great Migration. She wanted to tell the stories, what she calls the intimate stories of people who had dared to make the crossing. She spent more than 10 years, something I can relate to, more than 10 years researching this book, and the heart of it is oral history. She interviewed more than 1,200 people initially. I know, it's incredible to think of the labor involved there. And she saw this in the spirit of the Works Progress Administration project in the 1930s to collect the narratives of former slaves as that generation was aging, to try to get those stories before the generation died off. So she did this massive work. She narrowed it eventually. She got smaller pools and eventually narrowed onto 3 individuals to use as her main protagonists in the book. She interviewed those 3 folks who I'm going to talk a lot about for, she says, dozens, if not hundreds of hours. She traveled with each of them back to their towns of origin in the South. She interviewed friends and family members, people in their communities on both, the origins and the destination. She did a lot of sort of standard historical work, supplementary research in archives, in newspapers, etc. She read a wealth of secondary historical literature on the subject, and she reenacted her protagonist's journeys from the South. And I'll talk a little bit later about one of them, which was quite a fascinating and harrowing experience. And all this work paid off, as those of you who have read the book, I think, will agree. She offers a great deal of context. You learn a lot of history from this book. She draws from other historians who have studied the Jim Crow South, who have studied the migration, who have studied the lives of African Americans in the North and the West. And she makes a big case that the Great Migration transformed America, and it's a case that's easy to buy. She writes about the spread of musical styles, gospel and blues, and eventually rock and roll, the fact that the migration altered the political and social order of the urban North and West, that the Great Migration made the race problem a national problem, and really, in some senses, was the context in which a civil rights movement could emerge. But at heart, I mean, that's not the heart. She talks about these things. That's not the heart of the book. The heart of the book is a more personal story of these three individuals. Kevin Boyle, who's a historian who reviewed this book, said, and I fully agree with this, what makes the book compelling is the remarkable intimacy of the stories she tells, her ability to recreate in wonderfully lyrical prose the private struggles of particular men and women caught in a system designed to denigrate them. So let me talk a little bit about the stories she tells. The three protagonists she chose represent three different decades of the migration, and they represent three different origin points and trajectories. There were sort of logical systems by which these migrations occurred. So Ida Mae Brandon Gladney, who I think is her favorite of these, was a Mississippi sharecropper who moved from Chickasaw County, Mississippi, with her husband and children to Chicago in 1937. And this was one trajectory that from Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Arkansas, folks tended to go up to the industrial centers of the Midwest. Part of it was just where the trains went. George Swanson Starling, who was a fruit picker in Florida, Eustis, Florida, who moved to New York the next decade in 1945. And this represents the coastal states, folks who would go up the seaboard to the eastern urban centers. And the third is Robert Joseph Pershing Foster, who was a physician from Monroe, Louisiana, who had served in the Army in Germany and then moved to Los Angeles in 1953. Louisiana and Texans often went west to Arizona to California. What they have in common, she says, was an ambition to break free of the dangers and humiliations of the Southern racial caste system. And this leads us to the beginnings that she talks about. Why did migrants leave the South? And this is one of the arguments that she makes by using personal stories. In explaining the Great Migration, social scientists have tended to emphasize broader structural forces, right? The push-pull of economics in particular. So the mechanization of cotton, less demand for black labor in the South. The boll weevil, right? Less opportunity for rural folks in the South. The opening up of industrial labor with World War I and again in World War II and the cutting off of European immigration. So these big forces that certainly affect people, but Wilkerson sees these explanations as incomplete and also as, in a sense, taking away the individual agency of migrants. Right. Certainly these forces affect people, but people make decisions in a whole lot of complicated and more personal ways. If we listen to the migrants themselves, she finds, they left for, it sounds simple, but for freedom. They wanted to seek a kind of freedom that they simply couldn't have in the South. It's a collection of individual choices, in other words, that sort of add up to something larger. So the imposition of segregation in the late 19th, early 20th century, the brutality of the racial caste system. And I'm going to, instead of doing all the reading at once, I'm going to do little bits through to illustrate different points. She says those silent parties leaving Selma in the winter of 1916, she's just explained the story, saw no option but to go. Theirs would become the first volley of a leaderless revolution. There was no Moses or Joshua or Harriet Tubman, or for that matter Malcolm X or Martin Luther King Jr. to organize the migration. The best-known leader at the start of it, Booker T. Washington, was vehemently against abandonment of the South and strongly discouraged it. Frederick Douglass, who saw it coming but died before it began, was against the very thought of it and considered an exodus from the South a premature, disheartening surrender. Those entreaties had little effect. Ordinary people listened to their hearts instead of their leaders. Especially by the early 20th century, this generation didn't have a personal memory of slavery, and they chafed in particular at the subservience of the caste system and looked for a way out. Now, she includes some of the tragic stories of collective violence, lynchings, and riots. But to me, her story is most powerful in describing the impact of mundane, everyday humiliations that added up to a conviction to escape. Ida Mae Brandon Gladney, who could never pick 100 pounds of cotton. She just couldn't do it. Spending long, hot days in the field, her children unsupervised for little reward. Robert Pershing Foster waiting until white customers had been sold their movie tickets before he could buy his and climb up to the Negro section, which smelled like urine and had uncomfortable seats. George Swanson Starling, who I want to read a little bit about his experience here. And his father was Big George, so he's Little George. By the time Little George was old enough to notice, it seemed as if the whole world was crazy. Not because of any single event, but because of the slow discovery of just how circumscribed his life was turning out to be. All this stepping off the sidewalk, not looking even in the direction of a white woman, the sirring and mamming and waiting until all the white people had been served before buying your ice cream cone, with violence and even death awaiting any misstep. Each generation had to learn the rules without understanding why, because there was no understanding why. And each one either accepted or rebelled in that moment of realization and paid the price whichever they chose. No one sat George down and told him the rules. His father was quiet and kept his wounds to himself. George's teachers were fear and instinct. The caste system trained him to see absurdity as normal. So you can see the power of her prose, I think, in getting at the intimacy here. She also talks about these folks seeing a way out because early migrants provided models for them. Early migrants brought tales of freedom and upward mobility. In fact, worked very hard to prove that they had made the right decision by leaving. She tells a great story about her grandmother, coming home and making sure they got the car washed before they came into town so people could see they had made good in the North. And I wanted to read a piece of this. Several seeds were planted, too, in Ida Mae, Lil George, and Pershing. Ida Mae heard about this one or that one going north to freedom after a lynching or a raw deal at settlement. Her big brothers Sam and Cleve had fled to Toledo, and her big sister Irene was talking about going to Milwaukee. And as Ida Mae came of age, she saw the cloche hats and unobtainable finery of city living in the pages of the Sears Roebuck catalog out of Chicago. Lil George watched the Bly brothers, Babe and Reuben, older boys who'd gone north to New York, come back to Eustis in their zoot suits and fedoras. They talked about all the money they were making building the 9W highway up in Jersey, about the skyscrapers and streetlights and dance halls in Harlem and parties in Corona and the boulevards paved where the colored people lived. We used to sit up all night, George remembered, and listen to Babe and MB and Reuben and Freeman and all them talking about New York. And I said, boy, that sounds just like heaven. I want to see some of that. New York. I'm sure going to go to New York as soon as I get big enough. And in Monroe, Louisiana, if Manton Moreland passed through town, there was a stir in the pews and talk in the pool hall. Everyone wanted to sit down with the native son who had made it to Hollywood, even if it was only as a shuffling sidekick in the movies. In the three cases, the immediate catalyst for migration was somewhat different, but the themes are shared. So Ida Mae Brandon Gladney, I said she was a sharecropper with her husband in Chickasaw County, Mississippi, and they felt lucky to be on Mr. Ed's plantation because they sometimes came out with a settlement at the end. Most sharecroppers ended up in debt at the end of the year. Her husband's cousin, Joe Lee, was suspected of stealing turkeys and was brutally beaten by Mr. Ed, and she's got a description of that, and jailed. And her husband, George, made a decision at this point to leave. He came home and he said to his wife, "This is the last crop we're making." They quietly sold off their things before the crop came in. and had to do so quietly so Mr. Ed wouldn't find out they were leaving. This was sometimes a quite dangerous thing. You didn't want people to know. And they left for Milwaukee, where Ida Mae's big sister Irene lived. They ended up in Chicago. George Swanson Starling had spent some of his youth. His parents split up. He lived with his aunt, who was a root doctor, and then spent his late childhood living with Big George, his father, and his father's new family in Eustis. And he was a very, very good student and had dreams of attending college. And he did get into and attend Florida Agricultural, Technical, and Mechanical State College. But in the middle of his sophomore year, Big George said, "That's enough. I'm not paying for any more education." Big George had a 5th grade education and felt like he was doing all right picking fruit. He was running a little store, saving up to buy his own orange grove. And little George knew his father had the money. He had seen the deposit slips. And to spite his father, he ran off and married Inez, who was from the backwoods. His dad didn't think she was good enough for him. So he entered into a long and unhappy marriage at a young age, and picked fruit, sold insurance, ferried people around in his car as a makeshift taxi, trying to earn money. She says he called himself saving for the future. He was trying to earn enough money to send Inez to beauty school so then she could send him to finish college. Friends offered him a chance to go with them to Detroit once World War II labor demands increased to make a mint building B-29 cargo planes, and he jumped at it. And the stint in the North, this was a temporary stint, but it changed him. So I want to read a little bit about that. He had gotten used to carrying himself in a different way, talking to white people as equals in Detroit. Now that he was back in Eustis, he made a point to do whatever he could to keep from addressing white people as sir or ma'am. They'd say, "So and so, boy," he said. I would never say yes, sir, or no, sir. I'd say, "That's right, sure, certainly." "What do you mean by certainly?" would come the indignant reply. "You don't know how to say yes, sir?" A colored teacher who had finished at the University of Michigan ran into the same trouble in Mississippi around the same time. He needed to send a wire to a colleague and went into a drugstore to do so. The drugstore owner asked where the wire was going. "Do they have a phone there?" the druggist asked. "Yes, they do," the colored teacher replied. "Do they have a phone there?" the druggist asked again. "Yes, they have a phone," the colored teacher said, wondering why the druggist hadn't understood him the first time. "God damn it, when you talk to a white man, you say sir." The teacher, to avoid further escalation, addressed him as sir and walked out the door. There he saw a group of white men waiting. The teacher jumped into his car. "I didn't run," the teacher said, "but I made haste to my car and left that town just as fast as I could." George knew that the minutest breach of protocol could be risky, but had a hard time submitting to it. The North had changed him, and Mud and Sam too, and they couldn't go back to the way they were before. The three of them had a plan. They were tired of having to take whatever pennies the packing houses decided to pay them, and with the war on, not enough pickers, this was one of the few times the workers had any leverage. So he began organizing the pickers to demand higher wages. And this got him some days of higher wages, but also got him into a great deal of trouble. An acquaintance overheard the Grove owners talking about inviting the three of them, George and his buddies, to a necktie party. And he got out of town as fast as he could. So he went up to New York, where he had some aunts living. Robert Joseph Pershing Foster, who on his way across the country to California gave up the name Pershing, which he had been called his whole life, and took the name Bob, sort of a symbol of getting rid of the old and adopting a new, was the son of a school teacher and a principal, so relatively privileged for African Americans in the rural South. His father was president of the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association. There was some prestige, although he would get beat up often if kids had gotten in trouble at school. He paid the price. And his parents had great expectations of him. He went to Morehouse College in Atlanta and met and ended up marrying Alice Clement, who was the daughter of the president of Atlanta University and a very, very big wig in the sort of colored society in Atlanta and throughout the nation. He attended Meharry Medical School in Nashville, did a surgical residency, and then went to Austria with the Army as a surgeon. He always knew he wouldn't stay in Monroe, and he didn't want to settle in Atlanta because he knew he'd never be the head of his household. Alice Clement's father would be the head of the household. And he had dreamed of California since he was a youth. He loved the movies and would go and dream about California. And so he chose Los Angeles. He also thought he could get patients there because that was a destination point for migrants from his town and from his area. So they all left sometimes to save their own lives, but for very personal desire for something better, a chance for some kind of security, both physical and economic. And Wilson then sees them as in two ways, really, as immigrants. Here's the argument, right, is that they're immigrants, they have an ambition, they have gumption, they want to strive for a new life. Like other immigrant groups, they had that willingness to work hard and put everything into succeeding. But she also calls them refugees. In order to draw attention to that kind of trauma that they were fleeing. And she uses the Overground Railroad to kind of equate it to the Underground Railroad of slavery days. So then after all of this, they leave, and she discusses their journeys out of the South. And the most detailed description is Robert Foster, who drives from Louisiana across the Texas and to California. And it's a harrowing story because he can't stop, right? He can't stop at a motel because they won't take black people. It's a great read, and she tried to recreate this journey and not stop, and she brought her parents with her to kind of give her some background and context, and her parents insisted eventually that they stop, and of course it's their safety, right? You can't drive for 3 days straight. He describes this harrowing and humiliating experience, the third motel that he has stopped at. He pulled into the lot. There was nobody out there but him, and he was the only one driving up to get a room. He walked inside. His voice was about to break as he made his case. "I'm looking for a room," he began. "Now, if it's your policy not to rent to colored people, let me know now." And that's part of it. It was unclear where the line changed, right? Even if the law wasn't segregation, they never knew what they were going to run into. "Let me know now so I don't keep getting insulted." A white woman in her 50s stood on the other side of the front desk. She had a kind face, and he found it reassuring, and so he continued. "It's a shame that they would do a person like this," he said. "I'm no robber. I've got no weapons. I'm not a thief. I'm a medical doctor. I'm a captain and just left Austria, which was Salzburg. And the German army was just outside of Vienna. If there had been a conflict, I would have been protecting you. I would not do people the way I've been treated here." It was the most he'd gotten to say all night, so he went on with his delivery more determinedly than before. "I have money to pay for services," he said. "Now, if you don't rent to colored people, let me know so I can go on to California. This is inhuman. I'm a menace to anybody driving. I'm a menace to myself and to the public driving as tired as I am." She listened and let him make his case. She didn't talk about mistaken vagrancy signs or just rented rooms. She didn't cut him off. She listened, and that gave him hope. "1 minute, doctor," she said, turning and heading toward a back office. His heart raced as he watched her walk to the back. He could see her consulting with a man through the glass window facing the front desk, deciding in that instant his fate and his worth. They discussed it for some time and came out together. The husband did the talking. He had a kind, sad face. Robert held his breath. "We're from Illinois," the husband said. "We don't share the opinion of the people in this area, but if we take you in, the rest of the motel owners will ostracize us. We just can't do it. I'm sorry." And a little later, she writes, "And so the answer was no. Robert thanked them anyway, especially the woman. If it had been up to her, he would have had the room. I believe that with everything that's in me," Robert said when he was older and grayer. "This thing I've analyzed 3,000 times. This stayed with him deeply." So parts 4 and 5 of the book, The Kinder Mistress, describes their lives and their destinations and aftermath after that. Wilkerson, of course, doesn't romanticize the North and the West. She details the many barriers the migrants faced in trying to secure a better life, the restrictive covenants and public policies and violent defending of boundaries by whites that kept African Americans in overcrowded, overpriced, dilapidated ghettos, employment discrimination openly practiced, hostility from whites, but also from African Americans already there who feared that the migrants would reflect badly upon the race as a whole. She has a wonderful list of do's and don'ts that was published in the Chicago Defender to try to teach the migrants how to behave properly so they didn't embarrass us all. Gladney, in Chicago, her family moves from apartment to apartment in Chicago's Black Belt. They arrived in the Depression, right? Not much opportunity. Her husband, George, did various jobs and eventually landed a long-term position at the Campbell Soup Plant, which was his first indoor job. And she talks about the comparison of it to cotton picking. It's sort of... he had moved to a different part of the country but was on the same rung of the ladder, except now in Chicago he got paid. And Ida Mae did various jobs, including domestic labor, and eventually got a job as a nurse's aide in a hospital, which she really enjoyed. By the late 60s, their daughter was a school teacher. Their son was driving a bus for the Chicago Transit Authority. Another daughter was a ticket agent for the L. And the family together was able to buy a 3-flat in a newly opened neighborhood on the South Shore on an oak-lined street. Several weeks after moving in, the entire house across the street vanished. And within a few weeks of that, moving vans were clogging the street and every single white family was gone. Ida Mae remembered, "Lord, they move quick." She said, and then blacks started moving in, oh Lord. Very quick turnover destabilized the neighborhood, rentals that weren't kept up, and Ida Mae really she lives the rest of her life in this house. Wilkerson visited her in this house, and she sits on the second floor where she lives and looks out the window and sees the drug deals going on and sees the gangs hanging out. What did I want to tell you about this? Well, I lost my little space, but she writes that this is the kind of stable working class black family that you don't hear about, right? Not in political rhetoric and often not even in some of the histories that focus on the development of an underclass, right? Some kind of criminalized. I find her at parts she writes a little bit too starkly about sort of there's two populations, the underclass and then the stable working class, and from my research that's much too stark. But I think that in a sense that's how Ida Mae sees it, and that's how many of those folks saw it who saw what was happening to their neighborhoods. Okay. George Starling, I want to get through all three of them, arrived in New York during World War II and got a job right away as a coach attendant on the railroad. So he traveled up and down the East Coast on the Seaboard line. He was overqualified and overeducated for this job. It was a service job, but that's what he could get. And he ended up, interestingly, sort of a guide for other migrants, because that's the line he was working. And the job kept him away from home for days at a time. And his spare time, she says, he made the most of his free new self by spending time at dance clubs, gambling parties. His bad marriage was not improved by his time away or his leisure habits. He had a child with another woman. His daughter became pregnant at 13. His son became a drug addict and a drug dealer. She said George would rarely talk about his children, so great was his disappointment. George, she writes, had made a winless bargain. He had taken a job that kept him away from the very people he was working so hard to take care of. And he could not undo the damage already done. His absence only created a bigger gulf between him and Inez and left the children without a father most of the time and a mother with demons of her own to raise them practically by herself. Bob Foster. had trouble finding patients initially in Los Angeles, had to take a job collecting urine samples and doing physicals for an insurance company. He found it interesting that folks from home, if they could afford it, would go to a white doctor because they assumed it was better. He used his incredible salesmanship abilities to build himself a clientele, and his hard work, to build himself a clientele, eventually became a very, very successful doctor and surgeon, and gained great wealth and reputation. His most famous client was Ray Charles. And that's some interesting stories about that. Beautiful house. He gave his daughters all the benefits of upper middle class life, and one of them became a radiologist. Another a city manager whose son was courted by the Ivy Leagues. The family was very, very proud of this. But despite the success, Robert continued to bear deep psychological scars. Bred by the Southern racial caste system. And this is a place, for example, where I think storytelling and this kind of intimate look into people gets you somewhere that other kind of research can't. Because by all accounts, he looks to be, this is a success story, a triumph, right? But he drinks a lot. He gambles a lot. He's always trying to prove himself somehow. She says, for some reason, he was unable to fill up on what he had acquired any more than he could carry fog in his satchel. Particularly detailed planning for his 52nd birthday party in 1970. She tells the story. He's all the good and extraordinary things that had happened to him seemed never to make up for the rejection he had endured, and he set out to prove that he was better than what they took him for. Even though the people who haunted him would never see it, no matter what he did. So that's the story. The strength of the book, I think, like the best social histories, is these are ordinary people. These aren't on the front line. None of them are on the front lines of the civil rights movement, for example, right? They're not activists. They're not leaders in that way. In fact, with the exception of George Starling, they're largely apolitical. She talks about Ida Mae Brandon Gladney voting for the first time in Chicago. She did not see herself as taking any kind of political stand, but of course, in the simple gesture, Wilkerson argues this is an important political moment. In fact, when the orderlies and nurses' aides in her hospital go on strike, she walks the picket line. She works. Wilkerson writes, Ida Mae respected the strikers, knew them by name, and had worked right beside them and got along with most of them. But, she'd worked all her life, and she finally found a job that she enjoyed. And the concept of not working, a job one had agreed to do, was alien to Ida Mae. Wilkerson writes, I think, about the personal failings of George Starling and these kind of things with remarkable lack of judgment. She tells us their stories and she tries to understand their motivations and where they come from rather than passing judgment on them. Robert Foster consciously avoided politics. He was appalled, in fact, when his daughter Bunny, who was a student at Spelman at the time, considered maybe picketing a department store with other college students in downtown Atlanta. On this, Rufus Clement, Alice's father, and Robert agreed. Bunny simply could not be seen being arrested with the riffraff, all because riches wouldn't let colored girls try on hats. Of course, Robert understood the indignity, had lived it after all, which is why he had raised her in Los Angeles and taken her to Beverly Hills for whatever she and Alice and the other girls might ever think they wanted. It wasn't that he was against the civil rights movement. He was all for standing up for one's rights. It was just that to his way of thinking, the way to change things was to be better than anybody at whatever you did. Wear them down with your brilliance and enjoy the heck out of doing it. So he had no patience for these sit-ins, displays, at least for his daughters anyway, much less actual violence. Only George Swanson Starling seemed to have any kind of involvement with the civil rights movement. He raised money to send down south to help rebuild some churches that had been burned. And after the civil rights after legislation passed that barred segregation on interstate transportation, many of the conductors on the trains continued to tell the porters to tell the African Americans to move to the colored car when they crossed the line. And he would very discreetly and quietly inform passengers that they had a right to stay right where they were. This was quite dangerous for him to do, but it gives you this insight into some of the sort of smaller ways in which that movement, people were activists sort of in very small, everyday ways. So I think they're more representative in a sense than when we study activists. You know, historians tend to focus on those who are sort of out front in the movement. The last thing I want to talk about is Wilkerson's axe to grind. Sort of what is she really after here? And what I think she's really after is to resurrect the reputation of the migrants. She talks about the Chicago School of Social Science beginning in the 1920s that saw the migrants as incompetent. They were raised in a rural folk culture and they weren't competent to move into the modern city. And so it was this that caused the problems of the urban crisis, right? It's the migrants' fault. Even into the 1990s, I mean, Nicholas Lament's The Promised Land, if any of you have read it in 91, sort of repeats this argument, and it's a culture of poverty idea. She follows a trend in the social science and in the history that rejects that view, right? That data that, look, the migrants actually were better educated than the northern-born African Americans, that they made more money, that their families were stable, etc. And also in historians who have begun to really look at self-determination and agency rather than these folks as sort of buffeted pawns or buffeted by forces outside their control. But this is where there's my one critique, I guess, that I would want to make of the book, but I'll say it's not a critique in a minute. The problems of post-war America, it's not the migrants, but the next generation, there were some serious problems, and she describes some of those. George Starling's kids, right, for example. And she calls this next generation the lost grandchildren of the migration who have grown hard in the big city and did not absorb the lessons of the past or the good to be found in the steadying rituals and folk wisdom of the South. She seems to blame the city itself for grinding down those second-generation immigrants. It's a force, and there's not a lot of explanation here about the actual forces at work in fueling self-destructive behaviors, nor a sense of how widespread were they. In this way, though, I think what she's doing, I can forgive her, because that next generation's not the subject of her story. Her story is that migrant generation, and in a sense, she's taking on their bewilderment as they look at the next generation. The bewilderment of George Starling as he thinks about what became of his children. The somewhat bemused bewilderment, I think, of Ida Mae Gladney as she watches the street from her window or goes to the neighborhood meeting to talk about the problems in her neighborhood. Kevin Boyle, I think, said this nicely. He said, the questions of social scientists, what is the structure of poverty and of what is the structure of poverty and of policymakers, how can this be fixed, are not Wilkerson's questions. This is narrative nonfiction, lyrical and tragic and fatalist. The story ends. What Wilkerson urges, finally, isn't argument at all, it's compassion. And that's where I'm going to stop. So we have some time for discussion. Thanks. What are your thoughts?
We have a microphone for your use, and if you would like to ask a question and you're called upon, I will bring you a microphone so we can all hear you. Oh, I see the first text.
You indicated that you were reading it you were trying to read it in two different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Reading as a popular person reading it and as an academic. Can you give us an example from the book where you saw things differently from those two perspectives?
Yeah, that's a great question. The one that immediately pops to mind is this last point I made, that as a historian, and a historian of welfare reform debates and poverty, so I know this stuff pretty well. I felt really unsatisfied in her discussion of the post-war American city, she just sort of leaves you like some of these kids went off track, and she doesn't give you any kind of substantial explanation for why, and it sort of in a sense undermines her whole argument about that this is in a sense, is it tragedy or triumph, and she comes down on the triumph side. Right, this is a triumphant story, but what about this piece of it? So as an academic, I found that really, really frustrating. But as a general reader, or a lay reader, somebody who's not obsessed with those kinds of, of things, right? I was okay with it. I felt like, no, that wasn't what she set out to do, and it doesn't detract from what she has accomplished here.
I can speak up. Okay. I wondered if this is a research question, perhaps not dealt with in the book, but what was the difference between the people who left and the people who stayed?
That's a great question. I think there's an implicit point she makes about that, which is that the people who left had some kind of I can only do a gesture, gumption, right? There was some spark in them, and that's part of her trying to resurrect their reputation, right? That they had more in them, more. Yeah, gumption. I'm just going to leave it at that. In terms of the scholarship, there's a lot of social science stuff on this, and some has really shown that in terms of outcome, sort of how they fare, not a huge difference, really. Remember, the South is changing at the same time, and so I'm sure there are debates among social scientists about that kind of data, but she does deal with really interesting. So when she goes back with them, and some of that's in the book when she's back in their hometowns, and it's interesting to sort of see people are very well received when they come back, but sort of both sides, there seems to be a sense of wanting to justify their decisions and why it was better to stay or to leave. So I found that really interesting. I'm not answering very satisfactorily, but.
During this period, as the war ended and as the North was a magnet with a lot of jobs, there were also poor whites from the South moving too, and did they bring their attitudes with them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's another even more overlooked great migration in the U.S., I think, is, yes, poor whites from all over the South are flooding to these cities with these jobs. And yes, they did bring, not to blame, I mean, often it's sort of, well, we can blame the racism in the North and West on the Southern migrants, and that's way too problematic, right? But yes, they did come and were competing. In fact, there's why can't my brain work? There's a book about the Okies in particular, sort of trying to take on Steinbeck. You know, everybody thinks of Steinbeck, but trying to take that on and write a real history of that migration. So there is a history of Appalachian. I'm sorry, of Okies. But yes. Yeah. There's not a lot of that in this book. She doesn't actually, come to think of it, write a lot about relationships between African Americans and whites in their northern and western cities. And part of that, I think, is because they lived very separately. It was very segregated, right? So they didn't come in contact very much with whites. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I loved the book. But listening to you today, I couldn't help but think about the parallels that we're living today, right here in Corvallis, with the Latino population, and the migration. So many things that you said, a system, I think you said, Pope, the system designed to denigrate the individual. Hey, there we go, coming here for the promised land. Our newspaper today has a huge headline of a big raid of 15 Latinos who are just a block away in jail. I'm on my way over there to the court to be with a dear friend of mine. These are individuals. These are individuals who are parents, who are daughters, sons, all have their own story. I hope that there will be an Isabel Wilkerson who will tell Rafael's story, or Juventino's story, or Juana's. But I just, think that it's so easy for us to sit here and to think about the history of, many of us lived through the 60s, the 70s, but it's right here, right around us right now. And to somehow bring what Isabel wrote about, the humanity that she brought to Ida and Bob and George, to the guys who are over there in jail right now.
Thank you. Yeah.
Did she talk about many? Did she talk about many that actually went back? That they went north and then found that they didn't like it and then returned to the south?
A little bit, yeah. In the chapters on the actual move, she talks about yes, and many people did, and there was actually a lot of churning going on as well. It wasn't like everybody sort of left the town they'd been born in and went to one city and stayed there. A lot of migrants went to cities in the South first and then went or tried it for a time and came back. Absolutely. It's not the focus of it, but she does talk about it. And she also talks about remigration beginning in the 70s of African Americans moving back to the South. In fact, both of George Starling's kids moved back to the South. Both of them blamed New York for their problems and went back to Florida. Yes. That's sort of a next generation migration story would be the return to the South. Okay. Thank you.